War II.
So on your podcast and your writing, you talk about some of the most fascinating things I listen to talk about in terms of military conflict is tactics and sort of the details of combat. But allow me to stick on World War II for a second. There's a particular aspect to that war. I don't know if you can speak to it, where twice the number of civilians died than military personnel. So the Soviet Union, especially. Um, my grandfather was a machine gunner on in Ukraine as the Germans were marching towards Moscow. There's this important push in 1941 where they were trying to get before the winter to Moscow. And what Stalin was doing is he was basically throwing bodies at to slow the attack. And what that meant is everybody understood that your job was, you have this heavy machine guns. It's almost unreasonable to be able to be mobile in any kind of way with them. So you're thrown at the front and you're just nonstop shooting, and 95+% of people are just dead. Of the soldiers are just dead, and then you're just going back and back, and you're trying to protect as many civilians as you can throughout this whole process, but you don't. And so you have millions of civilians that die along the way into this march. Is there something you can say about this complete, perhaps it's naive of me to say, but a war that lacks tactics, that lacks strategy, and is purely about just no consideration of human life and just throwing bodies and bullets into a mix together where millions die? And that in particular felt much less like conflict and much more like torture or suffering. It didn't come off as torture, only that, interestingly enough, as you probably know, my grandfather, including everybody else, volunteered. They were proud to do this. They were proud to march to their death for country, for love of country. But the question on the civilian side, when more civilians die than military personnel, what do you make of that?
It's awful. And it's awful when a soldier dies. It's awful when a civilian dies. It's awful when 10 civilians or 10 soldiers, and it's even more awful when millions and millions of soldiers and civilians die. I think it's safe to say that the Soviet Union was facing an existential threat to their existence against the Nazis. So to not fight would be to die as well. Maybe die a death a few years later, maybe die a different way, but the choice was die now, trying, or die later on your knees. And I think the choice was pretty clear. As far as the tactics go, I mean, this is attrition warfare. That's what that is. We are going to keep, you said throwing bodies at the problem. That's attrition warfare. And the Soviet Union had a lot of bodies, more than the Germans. And when you fight with attrition warfare, whoever has more men and material will eventually win. It's an awful way, but that's what the strategy was.
You often talk about leadership. Let's put the evils of Hitler aside. The boldness of Hitler in making some of the strategic decisions he did was considered by many military historians quite brilliant early in the war, or insane and brilliant. Stalin, on the other hand, I think universally is seen as somebody who is terrible military strategist, especially early in the war. He did not see all the possible trajectories that the war could take. Is there something you could say about failure of leadership? Stalin, also the United Kingdom, before Churchill, and also FDR on the United States side, who basically was trying to turn a blind eye to everything that was happening over there, with a perspective of we just want to make we wanted to keep America's interest as the primary interest, and everything else let other countries work out their problems.
I think one of the things with Hitler was in the beginning of the war, he listened to his advisors, he listened to his generals, and therefore they did pretty well with that. I think as the war went on, he believed that he was smarter than he was and made decisions that were bad that cost him dearly. I mean, case in point, as everyone knows, going and attacking the Soviet Union while you're still fighting a war on the other front is not a good move. There's an example of, yeah, bad leadership, letting your ego get in the way, believing that you can do things that are beyond your capabilities. But as you mentioned in the beginning with Blitzkrieg, those were really dynamic and bold moves, and they worked. And what does that do? That fuels your ego and makes you think that you can win.